Today we're going to continue our study on King Solomon, but unfortunately we could spend time studying the house that he built and studying his fame. We're going to spend a little bit of time studying the fame of Solomon, but we're going to also study Solomon's decline. Yeah, Solomon is a great man. He's a wise man. And it's unfortunate that Solomon makes some of the decisions that he makes. And we're not going to go into all of those decisions this week. We'll probably go into some of those not next week, because Danny Allen will be with us next week for the beginning of our fall meeting. But time would not really permit us today to go over all of Solomon's wealth. But if you read 1 Kings chapters 9, 10, you're going to find a huge amount of wealth. Solomon was so wealthy, I think the Queen of Sheba really kind of sets it aside. This woman's a queen. She's heard of the fame of Solomon, and she's just blown away. She's just blown away by how wise and rich he really is. I do want to read a few verses here from 1 Kings chapter 10, and begin in verse 1. Now when the Queen of Sheba heard of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. Does anybody ever test us with hard questions? The apostles, I think it's Peter, says, be ready always to give an answer of the hope that lies within you with meekness and with fear. We should always be ready. Solomon was ready. She came to Jerusalem with a very great routine with camels bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. And Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, setting his officials at the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, his burnt offerings that he offered in the house of the Lord, there was no more breath in her. Now that's a way of saying he took her breath away. This is the magnitude with which Solomon is. This is a queen. She's visiting a king. And the grandeur of Solomon's kingdom just took her breath away. And she said to the king in verse 6, the report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and of your wisdom. But I did not believe the reports until I came, and mine own eyes have seen it. Behold, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and your prosperity surpass the report that I have heard. So that's the wealth and the wisdom of Solomon. That is great. And it would be a wonderful story had this continued throughout. But you know, when God first gave Solomon wisdom, God gave him wisdom and did not place a condition upon the wisdom. But God gave him, if you remember right, in 1 Kings chapter 3, let's back up here a little bit. We've studied this already. But in 1 Kings chapter 3 and in verse 3, it says, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. Solomon loved the Lord. And that is really what got him in the favor of God to begin with, was his love of the Lord. Do you love the Lord? Do you really love the Lord? Do you walk in his statutes? Do you keep his commandments? Do I love the Lord that much? Or do I pick and choose what I want to keep and what I don't? Solomon loved the Lord, and that's what got him. Solomon's request for God was for wisdom. God granted that request. I want to go down here in chapter 3 and remind us of this, even though we've studied it. 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 10 through 14, says, it pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked for wisdom And God said to him, because you have asked this and not asked for yourself. In other words, Solomon didn't ask a selfish request. His request for wisdom was that he might govern the children of Israel, God's people, as he should. He says, because you have asked for this and not asked for yourself, long life or riches, or for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding and discerning what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has ever been before, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you. And that's what the Queen of Sheba saw. No other king compared to Solomon in all of his glory in all your days. Notice verse 14, very important here. And if, there's a condition in this. If you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. That blessing came with a condition. The wisdom did not come with a condition. The wisdom came with a blessing from God. That blessing from God was placed with a condition. Sometimes God places certain conditions upon his blessing. We see that in verse 14, or after verse 15 here, but verse 14 of 1 Kings chapter 3, we see that condition, if. And if we flip back to where we are in our current study, in chapter 9, we read last week Solomon blessing the temple. And after Solomon blesses the temple at the end of verse 8, we see in verse 9, God again appears to Solomon. And again, God gives Solomon a very solemn warning. And it says here, as soon as Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord, the king's house that Solomon desired to build, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, as he had appeared to him in Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea. Remember last week we studied Solomon's prayer? And in that prayer, Solomon asked that God would bless the children of Israel if they walked in his ways. He asked that he would keep them and protect them if they walked in his ways. He asked if God neglected to protect them because they rejected him, would he please pardon them when they did decide to repent of their sins? So this is God's response to that prayer. The Lord appeared to Solomon here in verse 3, and the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea, which you have made before me, and I have consecrated this house, speaking of the temple that you have built, by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And as for you, you will walk before me, as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules. You know, God has rules. Don't mean this in a harsh or negative way. God has rules. They're set forth in his word. Then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you turn aside, here again, you'll notice that word, 3 letters, very short, but if you turn aside from following me, or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I set before you, but go and serve other gods, small g, idols. One of these days we'll study what an idol is. But friends, suffice to say for this morning's lesson, an idol is something, anything that comes between us and God. It could be a golf game. It could be just simply sleeping in. It could be anything that takes us from doing what God would have us to do becomes an idol. Ourselves can become an idol. Oftentimes that is the greatest challenge that we face, is ourselves and our own desires. James says, man is led away of his own lust and enticed. He says, God says in verse 7, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb. He says, nothing more but a saying, a proverb and a byword among all people. And this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone passing by it will be astonished and will hiss and will say, why has the Lord done thus to this land and to this house? Then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt and laid hold on other gods, small g, and worshiped them and served them. Therefore the Lord has brought all this disaster upon them. So God doesn't hide anything from Solomon. You know, God doesn't hide anything from us. He puts it just plain as day. Keep my commandments, I'm going to bless you. You walk away from my commandments, I'm going to destroy you, or allow you to be destroyed. Remember that temple and all that beauty of that temple. Remember how much gold was in that temple, kids? All the beauty that Solomon put into that, all the work. All that could be destroyed just because Solomon doesn't follow God. I want us to consider today choices. Solomon is faced with choices. God has set this before him. Satan's going to set this before him. You're going to see that as we study Solomon. Solomon's going to be tempted. And you know what? Sadly enough, Solomon is going to try what Satan sets before him. You know, if we look at the book of Ecclesiastes, as Solomon writes out as an old man, I'll spoil this for you. Solomon's going to follow after what Satan sets before him. And he's going to suffer the consequences. As a very old man, Solomon's going to come back to God and he's going to say, you know what? All that stuff Satan set before me was worthless. He said, I've tried it all. I said if they had heroin and opium and all this, all the drugs we have today, Solomon would have done it. He would have. That was the kind of guy he was. He said, I tried women. I tried booze. I tried everything. And I realized it didn't bring me happiness. There, I spoiled the next few weeks for you. Life is full of choices that require us to prioritize our lives based on those choices. There's simply not enough hours in the day. There's not enough money in our lives. There's not enough of anything for us to have everything. Solomon tried. Solomon tried, and he tried hard to have everything. But he couldn't. Not even Solomon could have everything. Generally speaking, we prioritize based on our own desires. What I want the most. I've often said, by default, we make the decisions and we prioritize our lives based on what's most important to us. What we like the most or what we want the most, that's what we do. Right? You've decided to be here this morning because this was the most important thing in your day. Nothing else was more important on Sunday morning, believe me. I've got a ton of things that I could be doing, and so do you. Staying in bed a little longer would have been a real nice thing. Kids wouldn't allow that anyway. But we've set the priority on being here because we wanted to. Today, there was nothing else more important. Sometimes we say, well, I just can't make a decision. Yes, you can. Because not making up your mind, not making that decision. And my wife will tell you that I take a long time sometimes to make decisions. But by not making up our minds, we're in and of that, just making a decision. If we say, well, I'm not going to make a decision on this, then we're making a decision by default. I want you to consider what Jesus says. Matthew chapter 6. Go back to our New Testaments. We're going to bounce into our New Testaments to try to make some modern day conclusions to what Solomon is going to face. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. See, we've got an advantage over Solomon. We've got Jesus. Solomon, he came thousands of years before Jesus. He didn't have that advantage. But we see in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24, we see Jesus says no one can serve two masters. For he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money, or your King James will say mammon. There's some debate, Bible scholars debate whether that word mammon means yourself or money. Either way, you can't serve two masters. If God says, I want you to do this, but you want to do this over here, you can't do both. And we have to decide what it is that we're going to serve. Over 400 years before Solomon is reigning as king, over 400 years before Solomon's reigning as king, Joshua told the children of Israel they had a choice to make. In Joshua chapter 24, as Joshua's an old man, he's led the children of Israel across the Jordan River into Canaan. What is Joshua famous for? Joshua's famous for one big act. What is it? Come on, kids, you can answer. You won't get in trouble. Peter? The walls came down. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Okay, Joshua fought that famous battle of Jericho, right? Well, Joshua's an old man here in chapter 24 as he's writing his, I'd call them memoirs. He's recorded everything up in his life that he's done so far. And as an old man, he sets a choice before the children of Israel. Chapter 24 and verse 14. Actually, we'll probably drop. We won't read the whole passage, but I do want to look at verse 14. He says, "Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve." Each of us is faced with a decision. Solomon is going to be faced with a decision. Who are we going to serve today? Every day we get out of bed, we're faced with a decision. Are we going to serve God? Or are we going to serve something else? He says, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and for my house, we will serve the Lord. We sing a song based on that verse. As for me and for my house, we will serve the Lord. But Joshua says you've got to make a choice. Solomon is with that choice, and Solomon is, how wise is Solomon? Very wise. He's very wise. So Solomon knows what the right answer is. In Romans chapter 6, Paul puts it very plainly for the Christian, the decisions that we have to make. Romans chapter 6, verse 15. Paul says, "What then, are we to sin because we are not under the law but under grace? By no means. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slave to the one to whom you obey, either of sin which leads to death, or of obedience which leads to righteousness. Paul puts it very simply. Whoever we choose to serve is our master. Is our master righteousness? Do we serve God? Or is our master sin, and do we serve Satan? Someone put it this way: we hitch our wagons to the horse of our choice. I kind of thought that was an interesting quote. You remember Lot? We studied Lot here on Wednesday nights when we studied the book of Genesis. Lot, it said, he pitched his tent towards Sodom. In other words, he gravitated towards a large city because of the things that it had to offer, the comfort that it had to offer. But in the end, he lost daughters, son-in-laws, and his wife, because he made the decision to go towards things that drew him away from God. We pledge allegiance to the loyalties of our choices on the decisions that we make. God created us with free will. The ability to make a choice. He gave it to us. He gave Adam and Eve a choice in the Garden of Eden. And that is a wonderful and dangerous thing. But He gave us that gift all at the same time. In Luke, you can read Luke chapter 38 if you want to, or chapter 10, verse 38 through 42. Sometimes we choose things that are not important. That passage deals with Mary and Martha. They invited Jesus to come to their house. And then Martha was so busy tending to things that she didn't get to enjoy spending time with the Lord. Do we invite God into our heart and then fail to spend time enjoying what God has to offer us? It's the same thing. Sometimes we make a decision to become a Christian and then we get so busy with life that we fail to enjoy. And I'm no exception to this. Sometimes I get so busy in my life that I fail to enjoy the blessings of having Jesus in my life. Just like Mary and Martha. Mary chose to enjoy Jesus, while Martha chose to worry about other things. Sometimes we choose the things that are not as important as others. There was a Christian that the Apostle Paul writes about in 2 Timothy chapter 4. And Paul writes a very sad commentary on this man named Demas. Let's just go back and see what he says. Sometimes I wonder if Paul were writing about you or I, what would he have to say? Would it be good? Or would it be something like what he's about to write concerning Demas? In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 10, Paul says this. He says, "For Demas, in love with the present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica." He said Demas made a decision based on his desires to forsake the Apostle Paul, maybe one of the greatest Christians to ever walk the face of the earth. Our thoughts don't always coincide with God's thoughts. Solomon is an old man. In Proverbs chapter 14, verse 2 says, "There is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end are the ways of death." Proverbs 14, verse 12. Solomon realized there were desires that he had that just seemed great when he was young. But he suddenly realized those were the ways of death. You know, I want to ask a question. There's a typo on this point, but I want to ask a question. Is our home a God-built house? In the book of Psalms, chapter 127, verses 1 and 2 says, "Unless God builds the house, the laborers labor in vain. If God's not building our house, our labor is in vain. Do we make the decision to let God build our house, to let God build our home? It's very easy for us to realize our physical needs. You know, Abigail just left the auditorium because she's hungry. She's cranky. She has a physical need. We all feel physical need. Hunger, pain, desire. We all feel those physical needs. Do we as keenly feel the spiritual needs? Well, Paul says 1 Timothy, this time in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and in verse 7 and 8. Paul says, have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourself for godliness. Now, this is an interesting concept, that we train ourselves for godliness. Yeah, I've known some guys that were into bodybuilding. I never was, obviously. But I've known some guys that were into bodybuilding. I had some uncles that were a little older than I were, and they had these big weights, and they built their muscles up. They trained for that. They trained to be the best-looking guys they could be. Do we train ourselves for godliness? He says, for while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. My uncles who are just a few years older than I am, they're in their 50s, 60s now. I remember when those guys were in their late teens, 20s. It's kind of funny. Those bodies are not what they used to be. They used to be really good-looking guys when they lifted those weights. And they're still in good physical health for the most part. But it's not the same. That's what Paul says. He said this physical exercise, there's some benefit to it, but only in this life. Spiritual exercise, out of this world. Paul says something else in 2 Corinthians. I want to go back here for just a moment. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 10. The Apostle Paul says, always carrying about in the body of death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our mortal flesh. Death is at work in us, but life in you. Since we have the same spirit of faith according to what has been written, I believe and so I spoke. We also believe and so we speak, knowing that he who raised Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. For it is all for your sake, so that the grace extends more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing us for eternal weight of glory beyond comparison, as we look not at the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen, for the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Paul says the decisions we make now are preparing us for eternity. So, final question. Do we live for today or do we live for eternity? Sometimes we make choices that are just that simple. A rich young man came to Jesus in Luke chapter 16, said, "What must I do to be saved?" Jesus told him, and that young man went away sad. He made a decision that day that he was going to live for what he had rather than follow Jesus. What about you and I? You know, I found one final quote I'll share with you. If it's important to you, you will find a way. If not, you will find an excuse. As my dear friend Joe Schofield used to say, an excuse is nothing more than the skin of the truth stretched over what really are the bones of a lie. Where are we at today? Are we following Jesus? Or are we making an excuse? Solomon is going to be faced with the decisions to follow God or to follow the desires of his physical life. Where are we? Won't you take your songbooks out and turn to number 68?